What's up, everyone? It is the 13th of December, 2025. In today's video, we're going to talk about what some people are calling the biggest college football news story of the decade. And indeed, it is quite a bizarre one. Over at the University of Michigan, who is just 2 years removed from a national championship, their new head coach, Sherrone Moore, was fired for an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. Now, that's strange enough, but it turns out that later that same day, just hours after being fired, Moore was arrested at the residence, allegedly, of the staffer that he was in a relationship with. And he is now behind bars for assault. In this video, we're going to talk about how this story is connected to the event I discussed in my last video, Superstream 98, the return of Philip Rivers to the NFL. Indeed, this story is part of the same code, same riddle, same theme. You see, Philip Rivers, before playing for the Indianapolis Colts in 2020, spent his entire career playing for the Chargers. Well, nowadays, the Chargers are coached by Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh bolted for the Chargers immediately after winning a national championship for the Michigan Wolverines. After his victory, he was replaced with Sherrone Moore, who is now in the news for this wild arrest story. Now, of course, in my last video, we discussed a strong riddle for the Catholic Church. How the return of Philip Rivers is all synced up with the death of Pope Francis and the election of Pope Leo, the first American pope. Quick shout out to my buddy Decoding with Cody. He's also been following this topic on his channel and has also helped me put together some of the connections we'll be making today. Jim Harbaugh, the former Michigan coach, is of course the brother of John Harbaugh. And Jim and John Harbaugh, the only two brothers to ever square off in a Super Bowl against one another. The reason I mention John Harbaugh is because he is the coach of the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore happens to be the home of the oldest archdiocese of the Catholic Church in the United States. When Philip Rivers was injured, when Daniel Jones was injured, the man that Rivers will be replacing in Indianapolis, Jones was replaced by a quarterback named Riley Leonard in that game. Now, Riley Leonard played his last year of college football at Notre Dame. And that's interesting because remember we had the Notre Dame fire back in 2019, and it reopened on the date December 7th last year. Well, December 7th was the same date, exactly 1 year later, that Daniel Jones went down with a torn Achilles. Now, the Catholic riddle runs even deeper because when Philip Rivers initially announced his retirement after the 2020 season, it was on January 20th of 2021. That date's important because that's the date that President Joe Biden took office at the White House. And Joe Biden, notice how he's the 46th U.S. president. He is just the second Catholic president in the history of the United States. This was a number I talked about in my post on Philip Rivers, as Rivers re-signed with Indianapolis on a date with 46 numerology. Vatican City equals 46, so does Rivers, and his number 17. Now, when Rivers played his first game for the Indianapolis Colts, it was on the 65th birthday of Pope Leo. And 65 is the ordinal gematria of the word horse. a quick glance at Gematria and the 4 base ciphers that we focus on primarily on this channel. We'll be looking at these a lot. Now, Joe Biden is from the state of Delaware. He was born in Pennsylvania, but grew up in Delaware, where he was a United States Senator. Back in 1776, during the Revolutionary War, George Washington famously crossed the Delaware River. Well, in Sumerian Gematria, Philip Rivers' unretiring equals 1776. And it just so happens that the next team that the Colts will be playing are from the state of Washington. So Rivers marches into Washington, reminding us of how Washington crossed the Delaware. George Washington passed away on the date December 14th. And December 14th is the date of this Colts-Seahawks game. So this means if you measure from the death of George Washington to the game tomorrow, we find it's been exactly 226 years. And in Gematria, when you write out George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River, notice how it has reduction or Pythagorean Gematria of 226. So as it turns out, this guy, Philip Rivers, is numerically connected to Sherrone Moore, and it's through the same numbers that we've been talking about a lot with the Catholic Church this year. When Sherrone Moore was born, Philip Rivers was 4 years and 57 days old. Now, the number 457 is a prime number, and that's the 88th prime number. Well, when Sherrone Moore was fired from Michigan and subsequently arrested on December 10th, notice how it was a span of 88 days after the new American Pope's birthday. And this is an important number to the code of the papacy that we've been discussing. Earlier this year, we had the murder of Charlie Kirk. And notice how Pope Leo was exactly 457 months old when Charlie Kirk was born. And Chicago is a city on the 88th meridian, Chicago, where Charlie Kirk was from. The 88th meridian. And then you look at Pope Francis and his date of birth, and we find out that he was born exactly 314 months after Chicago sports star Michael Jordan. 314, the first 3 digits of pi. 88 is a number made up of 4 circles. And what has Michael Jordan been up to lately? Well, he's been in the news because his motorsports team just settled a lawsuit with NASCAR, which is supposed to help propel the sport forward into the future. Speaking of Charlie Kirk, seeing as his wife has been making the rounds on the media talking about conspiracies, Charlie Kirk was born 10,888 days after Jim Harbaugh, and Jim Harbaugh played for the Chicago Bears during his time in the NFL. If I recall correctly, yeah, that was indeed the team he drafted, or that drafted him. And then he moved to the Colts, and then the Ravens, and then the Chargers. So you see how all of these teams that we're discussing are all connected to Jim Harbaugh. These are the teams he played for. One more note on Pope Francis, by the way, is that on the date of the Pi Day eclipse earlier this year on 3/14, he was a span of 88 years and 88 days old. And then he would die later that year in the year or at the age of 88. So with all that out of the way, let's start talking about the numbers that give us this news story. And we're going to be talking about the Skull and Bones Code. Then we'll be talking about why this arrest of Sherrone Moore occurred in the city of Saline, Michigan. Then we're going to talk about the amazing connections to the moon for this story, as well as the number 13, which is a very significant number of the moon. And then we'll cap this off with a few more notes, including how this is all connected to the book of Revelation and the number of the beast. So thanks again for tuning in. If you like the work, please do feel free to like, share, subscribe. More links in the description if you'd like more information. So this news story happened on December 10th, the firing and arrest of Sherrone Moore. December 10th is written as 10/12 in most parts of the world, but 12/10 here in the United States. The word affair has gematria of 121 in reverse. And with the S exception, University of Michigan also 121. Also a number of revelation. And indeed, this affair was quite the revelation for Michigan and its fan base. When you write out Sherrone Moore's full name, Sherrone Banfield Moore, notice how it sums to the golden ratio, 1618, using triangular numbers. The golden ratio was a riddle I discussed when I talked about Philip Rivers. Rivers retired 16 years, 18 days after his last game. His initials are the 16th and 18th letters. In Gematria, his name is 1618. This is the golden ratio, 1.618. His name also equals 4405, another number I mentioned in my last video. This news story is synced to the father of American football, a man named Walter Camp, the longtime player and coach at Yale University. Walter Camp, a graduate of the Skull and Bones Society. And don't forget, Yale University is one of the most successful colleges in the history of football. Notice how Yale is one of just 4 schools with more championships than Michigan. Walter Camp died 15,200 days after the founding of the University of Michigan. Michigan equals 152 in reverse. But let's talk about this Skull and Bones Code because it's extremely evident with these characters involved. When Robert Prevost became Pope Leo on May 8th earlier this year, notice how Jim Harbaugh was 3,202 weeks of age. That's interesting because Jim Harbaugh is 3,022 days younger than the new pope, who was born 30 years, 20 weeks, and 2 days before the new Michigan coach, Sherrone Moore. So 3 connections with the number 322 right off the bat. Also notice how Harbaugh was exactly 22 years and 6 weeks old when Sherrone Moore was born. Remember, George Washington's crossing of the Delaware has this 226 gematria. And Moore was fired 2 months and 26 days after the Pope's birthday. Now, the Skull and Bones Society was formed in December of 1832. So December, perhaps a good month for Skull and Bones riddles. Now, there's no precise date given for this founding. So what we find is that measuring from the first day of December in 1832 to the date of this news story was exactly 70,502 days. Well, 752 is the standard English gematria of the phrase skull and bones. 752. Well, if you measure from that same date, December 1st, 1832, to the birth of Jim Harbaugh, notice how he was born exactly 1,752 lunar orbits after that date, for another 752. And it looks like no coincidence because these same three digits are found in the gematria of skull and bones in Latin and James Joseph Harbaugh using prime numbers. In that same prime cipher, the name Sherrone Moore equals 527, which matches skull and bones with the ampersand in Latin. The University of Michigan was formed on the date August 26th. Measuring from the date August 26th to the date October 9th, which is Yale's founding date, we find that these schools were founded 322 days apart on the calendar. Also 115 years, which is part of the Skull and Bones Code. But the 322, of course, the number on the emblem. And I think this explains why Sherrone Moore was arrested in Saline, Michigan, a city which has standard gematria of 322, and 1009 using Fibonacci numbers. Fibonacci, one of the four main mathematical ciphers, all based in the alphabetic order. And the number 1009 is like Yale's founding date, October 9th, 1009. Furthermore, Saline, Michigan matches Yale University in all three of the major reduction methods, 70, 83, and 79. But think again about this city. Saline is the name of the city near Ann Arbor where Moore was arrested at the home of his alleged lover. Well, when you think about saline, this is a medicine, right? This is a mixture of salt and water. Salt is technically sodium chloride. And this is made up of the 11th and 17th elements on the periodic table, 11 and 17. Well, this is also interesting because the date 1117 is the 322nd day of leap years. Sherrone Moore was arrested 12 months, 23 days after 1117 was the 322nd day. Don't forget, Jim Harbaugh born on 12/23. But what's more interesting is that 11 times 17 is 187. And 1117 is the 187th prime number. This is a very unique relationship in numerology that I discuss very often. Brotherhood of Death, the nickname for Skull and Bones, equals 187. So does Jim Harbaugh's full name. James Joseph Harbaugh is 187. And all of this connects to George Washington, whose name is also 187 in ordinal. And of course, the 88 in reduction, which we talked about earlier. But it's important to understand that there's a deep, deep moon riddle here. Now, first we look at Yale's special anniversary back in 2023. If you've watched my videos, you know about it by now. In 2023, Yale turned 322 years old, which is just too perfect, isn't it? Feels like everybody should know about this. Well, if you measure from that anniversary to the date of Moore's arrest, it was 793 days, which is the Fibonacci value of the moon. The moon has a 57-degree range of declination. Notice how the word moon is 57 in ordinal. The word for eclipse equals 57 in Hebrew. Well, this is a number connected to Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh was born during Brown lunation number 507. So his moon number at birth connects to the number 57, right? When Jim Harbaugh won the national championship in 2024, Sherrone Moore was exactly 507 sidereal months old. A sidereal month measures the time it takes for the moon to orbit the Earth in relation to the stars. It's a little bit shorter than a synodic month, which measures from new moon to new moon. So you look at Sherrone Moore and find out he was born during lunation 780. The name Sherrone Moore equals 78 in reduction. The letter on the University of Michigan, M, is worth 78 in Sumerian. And skull and bones with the ampersand is 780 in that same Sumerian method. Sumerian, of course, simply multiplying the alphabetic order by 6, the first perfect number and a number of time. Harbaugh and Moore were born 295 sidereal months apart from one another. 295 is the gematria of the numbers 223, 322, and Skull and Bone Society. Now, the reason the number 223 is so important to this is because there are 223 lunations between each eclipse from the same Saros series. The word for the moon equals 223, like skull and crossbones. Masonic, another 223, which is found in Jim Harbaugh's 1223 birthday. This is all about the Michigan head coach, which equals 223 with capital letters. This former Michigan head coach was born 2,023 weeks after the death of Walter Camp, the father of American football. Sherrone Moore was born on February 3rd, or 203, which is the telephone dialing code for Yale University and New Haven. His firing was 2,000 months, 3 days after Walter Camp was born. But perhaps more important is that the arrest was 1,246 lunar phases exactly after Walter Camp died. 1,246 lunar phases. Well, that's interesting because the story was also 1 year, 246 days after the Great American Total Solar Eclipse, which was the second of two, quote, skull and bones eclipses over the United States. And 1246 is an important number to the moon because when Yale turned 322 in 2023, it was during Brown lunation 1246. And in Gematria, 1246 equals 223. Walter Camp also died 223 years after Yale was founded, which is interesting. But when it comes to the moon, a very important number is 13, as the moon has 13 lunar phases every couple of years. The word moon begins with the 13th letter and ends with the 13th letter in reverse. The moon and 13 even both equal 99. So this news story broke on the 10th of December, or 10/12. Check out the gematria of University of Michigan, Sherrone, Banfield Moore, and Walter Camp. All of them have 112 gematria. The phrase Michigan head coach is also 112, just like the Brotherhood of Death. In fact, both of these phrases also equal 220 and 347. Now, 347 is also the Latin gematria of the number 13. I haven't actually talked a lot about Latin gematria. This is usually a more significant cipher, one that's very significant to the Catholic Church in particular. Well, think about how Michigan has the big M on their helmet, and the letter M is the 13th letter. When Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines won the national championship a couple years ago, it was exactly 13 weeks after Yale's Skull and Bones anniversary. And then Sherrone Moore was fired a span of 100 weeks and 3 days later. Skull and Bones with the ampersand equals 130. The word affair equals 103. This affair was uncovered 13 days before Jim Harbaugh's birthday, and it was on a date with reduced numerology of 13. The gematria of 13 also matches felony assault, which may just be a coincidence. The gematria of 13 found in Skull and Bones founding and Jim Harbaugh's birthday. It's also been 113 weeks since Yale's big anniversary. Like the word affair sums to 113. His full name, Sherrone Banfield Moore, shares 113 gematria with University of Michigan. And the University of Michigan celebrates its anniversary 1 month, 13 days before Yale. Finally, I want to look at two more important numbers to Skull and Bones. And of course, their number is 322, right? But if you multiply the digits in this string, you get a couple of other relevant numbers. So first, we get 3 times 22. This is 66. Notice how the name Moore equals 66. So does Sherrone Moore. And Sherrone Banfield Moore is 660. All syncing up with the last coach at Michigan, Harbaugh, which equals 66. When Yale turned 322 years old, Sherrone Moore was exactly 1,966 weeks old. That's also exactly 466 lunar phases old. If Michigan wins their next game, they'll even have 996 all-time victories. The number 66, by the way, has the same gematria as Skull and Bones. 149 and 41 in reduction. But there's another way to look at this. If you instead take 32 times 2, well, then you get a product of 64. Skull and bones equals 604. This embodies the numerology of secret society, which is 640. The Skull and Bones Society is headquartered at 64 High Street. Well, in the alphabetic order, Michigan equals 64. Jim Harbaugh, another 64. And, geez, I guess there is more here. Of course there's more. There's always more. So this arrest happened 2 years and 62 days after Yale's big anniversary. In ordinal, Michigan coach Sherrone Moore equals 262. Jim Harbaugh was born 262 years after Yale. But if you include the end date, it was 2 years, 63 days after that date. Order of the Skull and Bones, Skull and Crossbones, and Masonic all equal 263. This society was formed 20,603 days after Independence Day. College football, 263. This was also 7 weeks and 6 days before Moore's birthday. Skull and Bones and Secret Society, both 76. It was 76,077 days after the founding of Michigan. Now, the last thing I will look at today is this Revelation code. And again, this all happened on December 10th. Or 12/10 on the calendar. Remember, 121 is the 11th square number. The 11th triangular number is 66, and Revelation is the 66th book of the Bible. And it reveals 666 as the number of the beast. Well, notice how when you use prime numbers, Sherrone Banfield Moore equals 666. Revelation is an apocalyptic tale of the Antichrist and the second coming of Jesus. Notice how all of these words and phrases equal 121. Sherrone Moore was born on the date leaving 331 days on the calendar. 331 is the value of Patmos, last, second coming, and God's Son. And it's said that the book of Revelation was written by John of Patmos, and it's the last book of the Bible about the second coming of God's Son. 331 is the 67th prime number. The word affair equals both 331 and 67. And then this affair made it to the headlines on a date with 67 numerology. So naturally, you see a guy with the gematria of 666, particularly when Michigan is gearing up for their 996th win. 9s and 6s. All comes together a little bit too nicely, doesn't it? And again, it's all part of this whole mega riddle that I devoted an entire super stream to earlier this week regarding the return of Philip Rivers. All synced up with the crossing of the Delaware River. And just yesterday, we get all this flooding in Washington, right? The rising rivers. It's just crazy. And I mean, this whole year, has been insane for flooding. And it makes a lot of sense when you know Gematria. The word flood equals 20 and 25. And all throughout the year 2025, we've been inundated with floods. In fact, it happened to me. I almost lost my home to a flood earlier this year in Milwaukee. On August 10th, we got 14 inches of rain in 12 hours. And I'm not making that up. That's how much freaking rain we got. My whole basement wall collapsed. My neighborhood was underwater. This is not a floodplain, by the way. And it just so happens that I predicted a Milwaukee flood riddle just days before it happened. And I was able to do that through numerology and synchronicity. Because apparently I have a deeper understanding of this code than most people out there. I think most people out there don't even know this code exists. They're ignorant of it. They think people who look at it are crazy. But they are the true fools, completely unaware of what this matrix they've inhabited is truly made of, which is a group of souls finding their way to further enlightenment. A temporary world that we inhabit, one we may even come back to if our task here is incomplete. All right, so that's going to do it for this one. I just wanted to make sure I talked about this rather bizarre news story. You know, there's typically one of 4 categories that I cover here on Gematrinator 85. We talk a lot about, U.S. and geopolitical events, sports games, celebrity and athlete deaths, but it's also just really strange news stories. And when a Division 1A coach of a national championship winning program gets fired and arrested in the same day, certainly that qualifies. So that's going to do it. Once again, check the links down in the description below for more, particularly if you'd like to become a member of Gematrinator.com, which helps support this work, as well as keeps the website online and gives you more powerful decoding tools. Big news on the website coming next week. Look forward to talking about that. Peace, love, God bless, and we'll talk to y'all next time. See ya.